Hello and welcome. If you ask Americans what they find positive about Muslims, the majority will reply nothing. The second most common response is, I don't know. And that disturbing finding laid the foundations for what became the biggest poll of the Muslim world. After conducting tens of thousands of face-to-face interviews with Muslims in 35 countries, the Gallup organization believes it has answered some key questions about what Muslims believe and think and what they want specifically from the West. On today's show, we examine the views of everyday Muslims in order to find out who speaks for Islam. And don't forget, we take your calls on the show and you can reach us at the numbers at the bottom of your screen. Well, joining me now is Dr. John Esposito, the founding director of Georgetown University's Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, and Dalia Mogahed, the senior analyst and executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies. Dr. Esposito and Ms. Mogahed analyzed the data from those tens of thousands of face-to-face interviews for the book, Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. I welcome you both to the program.
It's wonderful.
Thank you.
But Professor, if I could start and ask, you say you wanted in this book to democratize the debate, that is to have a better debate between the West and Islam, or at least the West and the silenced majority, as you put it. Now, what do you mean specifically by that? And how do you answer the skeptics who say, will this really change anything?
Well, I think that first of all, when you really look at the reality, most people's perceptions and a lot of the debate has to do with what the bin Ladens of the world say and the explosive headline events that often one sees in the media, as well as the fact that you do have a battle between experts here. There are different camps of thought. And what this does is when you've got this massive amount of data, it enables people, in terms of democratizing it, one can say, look, you don't just have to listen to this expert or that. You can actually see what are the very people that they're talking about, what do they have to say. I think that's, a major shift. We now can literally say, let the data lead the discourse, the debate or the discussion. Just
so our viewers understand it, Dalia, if I could ask you now, the poll, and you work with Gallup, of course, so the poll is statistically accurate to plus or minus 3%.
Yes.
It was a huge sample, one of the biggest done of its kind, but you couldn't go into certain areas. You didn't poll certain areas, Muslims in certain areas. I know there's certain countries whose voice was left out. And considering that, how accurate can this poll be?
Well, Riz, that's an important question. We couldn't go into certain countries for security or other reasons. So we didn't poll in Somalia, we didn't poll in Syria. But what we did do is poll 90% of the global Muslim population, making this the largest and most comprehensive study ever done of Muslim opinion. So we're confident that we can actually say that we understand what a billion Muslims really think.
Let me ask you to address an email question that was pretty direct in its comment. It came from Shadab Khan in Doha, in Qatar. And Shadab wrote in saying, Muslims want the West to leave them alone. They don't want to tremble thinking the West will liberate them. And it's a reference, it's a reference to the West and to Muslims, the us and them that seems to always come up when people talk about the idea of a clash of civilizations. Now, I know that the book says that there isn't really, that certainly Americans and Muslims actually have more views in common than difference. And so it was the perceived foreign policy of America that angered Muslims. So what is it specifically that America is doing wrong?
Well, when we really look at the data, we should first of all take a step back and ask, what is America doing right? And I think it's always a good place to start. People in majority Muslim countries talk about what they admire about the West in terms of democracy and technology. When it comes to what they want changed, it's really around things like acute conflicts and support for non-democratic governments.
Professor, what surprised you the most looking at the information that came from this poll?
Well, I think there were a number of things. One, what I liked about it was that it does defy a good deal of conventional wisdom. That didn't surprise me. That was good from my point of view. Right. But I think that what was surprising was to see how the people that we call politically radicalized, that is the 7% of the world's Muslims who aren't violent themselves, but who in fact think 9/11 was justified and who are strongly anti-US, that in fact they economically, educationally, are more prosperous. They're more positive than even the 93% of moderates. But even more importantly, they believe even more than the moderates that democracy is the way forward. But it does answer your email person in terms of their attitude. Their attitude is that they're far more cynical. And what they don't want is the interference of the West, or the potential invasion or occupation of the West. So it was the idea that politically radicalized are not people who don't admire many of the things that we stand for, but they don't like what we actually do.
Now that radicalized 7%, actually 7% is quite high.
That's
when you look at it.
91 million potentially.
Right, and then when you look at, you describe it as being a potential sort of nuclear explosion of emotion, I guess. Specifically, how much of a threat is that?
Well, I think that what I think policymakers have to think about, see, I think these are the people that, in terms of notions of public diplomacy or winning the minds and hearts, these are the people that should be looked at. Terrorists, you have to capture, kill, or contain. But if you're talking about trying to improve relations, if you're also talking about drying up the seedbeds of potential recruits for extremists, then you've got to address this segment of the population, because it is a significant segment, but it's not a segment that is, in a sense, beyond the pale. It's clearly a group of people who would like us to walk the way we talk, who want many of the things that we have: accountable government, self-determination, etc.
Actually, I want to bring up something with Dalia. Being a Muslim woman, I was, talking to you about this. I was particularly surprised on the views on women and how many Muslims felt that life for women in the West is actually degraded in terms of cultural status, which, I mean, is kind of a contrast to how many Western people see being the stereotype of Muslim women being oppressed, the other way. And again, when you look at what was said by Muslims about the role of women in Islam, what was either surprising, encouraging, or disappointing?
Well, I think that the views can really be characterized as very complex. So on one hand, people wanted equal rights for women. Both men and women wanted that for women and thought that should be the way it was. They also associated these things with the West, but at the same time they associated a certain cultural degradation with Western culture in regards to women. So one Malaysian respondent said that she feels sorry for Western women because they feel like they always have to please men. Really similar to what some Western women might say about Muslim women. But what was really underlying all of this was that people wanted change, wanted equal rights for women, but wanted it through their own cultural context.
To what extent, Professor, was 9/11 a turning point in attitudes?
I think 9/11 is a major turning point in terms of attitudes, both in the West and in the Muslim world. If before 9/11 there were those out there who talked about a clash of civilizations, a political, historic, and sort of cultural and military threat, 9/11 seemed to solidify that in the popular imagination, and it let loose a whole set of people who are, in fact, people who promote the clash. As I said at the beginning of the program, it's not just the violent terrorists. It's many of your sort of right-wing politicians in Europe and America, political commentators, and some sort of academics who really reflect and promote a polarized view of the world in which there is not a distinction between Islam and Muslim extremists, but rather Islam is the problem.
Was there anything in the results, Professor, that changed your own views or perceptions, perhaps misconceptions about Islam? I mean, you're read up on it, so it's kind of...
Yeah, I did not find that much that surprised me, but that may be the fact that that I've spent years and years all over the Muslim world. So, in some ways, what I liked about it was that I felt that it could now be part of an arsenal that one could use.
Get some affirmation. Well, let's get a quick call in before we take a break. Ali is on the line from Saudi Arabia. Ali, what would you like to ask?
I just want to ask a simple question. Why the West is so worried about Islam?
Okay, I'll ask the professor to answer that perhaps first.
Well, I think that the reality of it is that, for Westerners who, let's say, did not know much about Islam, their engagement with Islam begins with the Iranian Revolution, where you have people who are on the one hand are saying they're establishing an Islamic Republic, and on the other you have people demonstrating every day saying death to America. The rhetoric of Saddam Hussein during the 1991 Gulf, the rhetoric of bin Laden, all of whom say they're doing it in the name of Islam. See, I think what some people miss here is it's not just a matter of saying, well, the people who are doing this just happen to be Muslim. They're just extremists. But these are people who legitimate what they do in the name of Islam. Right. And that's what I think creates the problem.
Well, a quick question for Dalia. In answering that, I also wanted an email question that we got from the Philippines, which also touches on this. So, looking at this viewer writing from the Philippines, Valdemar Tamaya says, the vast majority of Muslims want one thing from the West, to immigrate. And as far as believing that violence against civilians is justified, the answer is always. Now, when you look at that kind of, obviously a very personal but biased in their, other people's view of Islam, what merit is there in getting the same kind of comprehensive poll of non-Muslims on views on Islam?
Well, in fact, Riz, we have. We have done a great deal of research in the West about what people believe about their own societies as well as Muslims. So we found, for example, in the United States that like you said in the beginning, the most frequent response when asked what you admire most about the Muslim world was, in fact, nothing. That was 33% who said that, most frequent. And the second most frequent was I don't know, which made up the majority. And so we are doing a great deal of analysis on what people in the West do believe about Muslims. And what we find is exactly what John just said, that there is this misunderstanding fundamentally about the faith and therefore the people who follow it.
Well, stand by, we have more questions. In a moment we'll look at the challenges of changing some of those negative perceptions of Muslims, illustrated here by our own result from asking people on the street, what comes to mind when you think of Islam? We'll see after the break.
The first thing I think about is negative, how a lot of Islamic fundamentalists have made a bad name for Islam in general.
I think that the world is hyper-conscious right now of Islamic extremism because of the global problems in a lot of countries.
I have to admit, unfortunately, something that does come to mind is militant Islamism, which is terrifying, I think, and really important to us today.